It works. Great. Okay, so go ahead and navigate to those images. And just to give you an idea, we are going to, I would say, roughly be working if you've printed out or have it available with the part of the classroom handouts if you're interested in the optimizing images. And unfortunately, I haven't added pages to this or page markers. So it's going to be at the beginning. At the top, it says optimizing images. Some people refer to it as edit. And we can start from here. So if you're not seeing what I'm seeing when you touch an image and pull it up here, uh, sometimes you may only see the few icons down at the bottom that starts with preset. Lightroom is trying to kind of make it a little bit easier to navigate. So there's going to be a slight difference from what I have in the book. So this is a newer version that we have on our phones now. And if you just slide up, and again, anytime, oops, that you see my finger and it's a red dot, that's essentially a cursor on my finger. So I'm just going to push up there, and then it brings up some additional tools that we have to work with. Now, one of the first things I like to do is to crop my images because my feeling is very strong that if it's not adding to your image, it's detracting from it. So I really like to do the cropping first because I find that it's a lot easier to get rid of something that I don't like than to think about using some of the tools to lighten it or darken it or to make it go away. So the tool that I want to use is the crop tool. Unfortunately, they haven't allowed us to rearrange these palettes or tools in the order that I prefer to use them in, but that's just how it is for right now. So we're going to go to the crop tool, which is the one second from the left on the bottom row. And so it looks, how do you describe that icon? Just sort of like a little square with arrows going in different directions. So that's going to be the crop tool. And if you look on the far left side and tap that, you're going to see that we have standardized crops. So we have 1-to-1, which is a square, and then different variations as well too. So um, if you are going to think about printing your work, then I would strongly encourage you to use one of the standard crops. I tend to like a 2x3, which is sort of very similar to what a traditional camera would shoot. If I'm going to be cropping something that's a landscape, that I will frequently try to crop it as a 16 by 9, I guess they call it this 9:16 aspect ratio. So it's a bit more rectangular. Now, if you aren't going to be printing your work, then don't feel that you necessarily have to crop to any of the standards. I just tend to do it just more, I think, out of habit and to have consistency in my crops and my working. But I would rather crop and change the aspect ratio just a little bit to get rid of something or to include something than to be rigid and say, oh, it's got to be a 6:4 aspect ratio or something like that. So it's kind of how it works for you. So for this image, I'll just keep it as a 2:3 aspect ratio, which is the same thing as a 4:6 image, which I think works well as a portrait. I think that for the 16:9 aspect ratio, it doesn't work very well as a portrait orientation. I just find it a little bit too skinny. So the way to work with the crop tool is to think that your photo is underneath and the crop is like a frame on top of it. And so we can take our image and if we like a pinch with two fingers, it allows us to zoom in, and then we can also just take and move the image around with our finger. And I've realized that I actually find it easier to crop on the smartphone than it is on the desktop version because I don't have to manipulate it with the cursor on a mouse. So it just is a little bit easier to do. So for this image, I'll just go ahead and crop it to something that looks good here and get rid of that wagon on the left and look at my edges to make sure there's nothing distracting. And so the crop is pretty good, but there's just one issue. And does anybody notice it?
The shadow.
Not so much the shadow.
In the back in the middle, there's like an umbrella or something.
Not especially that. It's a subtle thing.
Little cockeyed.
Yes. So if you look at the banister in the back, that's clearly going to be up and down. Something has happened to my computer. Is everyone still seeing what I'm
Yeah.
broadcasting?
Yeah.
We're seeing it.
Yes.
Okay, just somehow I've lost you, so I can't see you for right now, unfortunately. And I'll just have to make that trade-off. But yes, I'm a big stickler on really making sure that particularly your horizons are level. Your eye is really good at discerning if it's off even a little bit, and it will throw the experience of the viewer off looking at the photo if they say, this doesn't feel right. This isn't really how I see the world. And so we have a couple tools for dealing with that. The first one is down at the bottom is the straighten tool. And so if we just go ahead and hit straighten, I'd say about 80% of the time, this does what you want it to do. And I kind of miss everyone there. Okay, we'll come back here. So I'd find 80% of the time it does a good job, and about the other 20% of the time it just really messes it up completely. And if that is the case, and not only with this tool, but many of the other tools in Lightroom, if you look at the top in the right, there it looks like a U-turn arrow. That means to undo what you last did. So that's going to either give you the option to undo the immediate last thing that you did by hitting just the arrow down below, or if you wanted to reset the crop completely, you could go ahead and do that by selecting the lower one. I only want to just say would want to do one step and turn it back the way it was, just to give you an example of how to do the undo tool and also what to do when the straighten tool doesn't really work for you. So what you can do is you can place your finger at the bottom of the image here and just move your thumb or your forefinger right or left, and that's going to rotate the picture. And then that's also going to superimpose these grid lines that's going to give you a reference point for straightening things up as well too. So if you decide that the traditional crop isn't quite working for you and you want to change that, you can also, to the left of the straighten button, hit the lock button, and that will undo that aspect ratio, and then it will allow you to move all the edges independent of each other. So we've got that. And then we also have the ability to rotate our images as well too. So sometimes if you shoot particularly down, that will kind of mess up the camera's ability to calculate what is horizontal or vertical. And so you may have to just manually rotate it yourself. And then we have a couple other tools, the flip vertical and flip horizontal. And I can't think of a great reason to use these with the exception of if you wanted to create a selfie that is how you see yourself, then you'd probably want to use the flip horizontally. Because remember, every time you look in the mirror, you are seeing yourself backwards. So if you wanted to see yourself as you're used to seeing yourself, you would then need to flip the image backwards so it would be consistent with what you're traditionally used to seeing. But I don't have a great need for that, so I'll just keep it that way. And then if you're happy with the crop, then you can hit the check mark in the lower right corner. Now, also in some of these screens, you have a question mark up at the top. So if you have a question about using the tools, this can give you sometimes a little animation or a little bit of help as well too to guide you through it if you forget how to work with it. So again, if you're happy with it, I'll just go ahead and hit the check mark in the lower right corner and go ahead and accept that. So if I want to then go back to my other images, hit the arrow in the upper left corner, and then that will bring me back to the gallery or the images that I was in. Um, Here's another example. That can show you how well that straighten tool can work. So instead of just having to try and do it manually, if I just hit straighten, give it a second, and it will do a good job of straightening the horizon out. Now, sometimes you've taken a shot and you realize, well, I intended to shoot it as a vertical or horizontal, but I want to see what it's going to look like the other way. The easiest way to do that would be in the upper left-hand corner to be able to rotate your crop. And so now I can turn this image into a vertical and not necessarily seeing that being something that's all that interesting, but just to give you an idea that maybe you were working on an image or you had a greeting card and you really wanted to have a vertical image, this would allow you to be able to crop it and keep the vertical that way. Is there a question or a stretch?
Oh, sorry, it's a stretch.
Okay, that's fine.
Been here since.
Feel free if you need a break to get up, move around. That's definitely fine. Okay. Um, Going back here to my other images, sometimes the image that you want to shoot or that you did shoot may not be necessarily the image that you wind up with. And so as an example, if we look at this image, I I liked it when I looked at the scene, but when I shot it, I wasn't really all that happy with how it turned out because it was kind of a turn around and grab shot. And so the foreground doesn't really have the sharpness to really warrant having much of it in my photo. And so I just started playing around with cropping it and just thought, well, what if I come up with something like really different? Oh, come back here. And then I ended up cropping to something like this. And what happens if I rotate it? There, okay. And so I ended up seeing that the image that I wound up with, oops, I see a little something on the very edge here, is just pull that in a little bit more. Ends up being a really different, oops, come back. The really different image than what I had initially intended to be. I think I can't do that rotation because it messes things up. So actually, I would probably rotate that, or rather crop it a little bit more from the bottom just to clean it up a bit more so. There we go. So you can see that this is, very different image than what I initially shot, but I think ultimately a lot more pleasing than what I ended up with after I shot it. Any questions on cropping? Okay. I tend not to teach this as much or emphasize it as much in the smartphone class because I find it doesn't tend to be as much of an issue, and that is white balance. And so white balance is simply how does the camera respond to how you took the picture, to the light when you took the picture. And I can say, well, this ended up being a nice morning shot. We've got the nice cool tones of the sunrise. But when I looked at the image, I could actually see that uh, I shot it at about 6:30 at evening. So what this told me and was that I basically had the white balance setting off on my camera. Now, I find that the smartphones tend to be much more forgiving than my traditional larger camera. And so this was actually taken with my Nikon. And so if we wanted to correct the color here, we can go into the color tool, and that's going to be on the upper row, third over. And then we could take this little eyedropper tool. And what that does is that you want to place it on something that should have no color to it. So something white or gray, and you put that right over it. And so this corrects that white balance. And if you like how it corrected the white balance, you can hit the check mark that's around 2 o'clock. If you don't like where it grabbed it from, you can always try another part of the image, but this seems like it did a good job, so I'm just going to go ahead and accept it. Now, in that vein, I like to make a difference between accurate white balance and pleasing white balance. So I could, in a very conservative way, say, well, what color is snow? And I could say, well, yeah, snow is white. And so I could go ahead and correct the white balance and say, there, that's correct white balance. So it may technically be correct, but it's not particularly pleasing. So I really encourage you to use the white balance tool for uh, something that looks good. So frequently with people, what I'll end up doing is if I need to do a accurate white balance, I'll go ahead and do so on something that's neutral in the image. But then I'll go and take this temperature slider. So know that the white balance tool consists of two sliders, a temperature slider that is a blue-yellow continuum, and a tint slider, which is a green to magenta continuum. I rarely need to use the second one, the tint. It's almost always going to be the first one, the temp, because that corresponds with the way that um, our images respond to either incandescent light, like indoor lighting, or to shaded light that tends to be cool. So with people, if I need to do a correction for white balance, I'll try to find something neutral, but then I'll go and take the slider and nudge it just a little bit over to the right to warm things up because people look better with warmth than coldness to them.
One observation is that when I imported the last two pictures from your classroom to Lightroom, it seemed like to have automatically adjusted them. So we didn't necessarily have to do the white balancing. It somehow importing it to Lightroom kind of corrected some things.
Uh-huh.
I'm just letting you know. I mean, I still played around with the settings, but it was already on a picture that looked balanced as opposed to the one you had in your examples.
Okay. I know that in the app it does give you an option to apply a setting or a preset to your images, but it could be that depending on the image, it may have read that file and may have made corrections based on it may have been possibly being a raw file. And so reading the information that was embedded in that raw file. That's what my guess is. Whereas if you saw a preview, in Google Classroom, that may not have the ability to read the raw file and its color corrections. That's just my best guess right now.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so that is going to probably be doing it for the cropping and the white balance tool. Let's talk a little bit about optimizing images. Does anything kind of come to mind when you think about optimizing images, or if you've ever played around with it? Have people worked with adjusting images?
I have adjusted images, not in Lightroom, but just in the camera app.
Uh-huh.
And it just, yeah, I mean, it's intuitive, right?
Um, any kind of things come to mind when you think about optimizing images, or do you have like an approach or a plan?
I mainly I actually, it's interesting, I was noting as you started, Reed, that I do the same. The first thing I do is crop and level, or I think I do level and then crop
Mm-hmm.
automatically already. And then I just play. It seems like it doesn't have the same options in Lightroom as it does with the app. I play with the brightness just to try and bring the colors out,
Mm-hmm.
but nothing, this temp, tint, vibrance, saturation. I'm still not completely sure. I think it's just a matter of playing with them.
Yeah, it's actually in the section that they call what do they call it here? I think they call it light. So, and they've done a really good job of confusing people because they call these slightly different things between the desktop version and the mobile version. So if you ever work with a desktop version, know that this is going to correspond with what's called the basic panel in the desktop version, but they call it light here. And this will probably have the tools that you're looking for. Anybody else in terms of optimizing images? Okay, so I tend to think of it as a few things, and the first thing is, again, as the cropping or the composition. So getting rid of things as much as I can. And ideally, as I've mentioned, you want to try to shoot things with the composition and the end photo in mind, looking at the edges, seeing if there's anything that's distracting and working to eliminate that before you shoot it so you don't have to deal with it afterwards. So having composition that's pleasing and clear for what's important for your viewer to look at in your photograph. And then, as I've mentioned, I would say most of what I think of optimizing images simply comes down to lightening and darkening. And sometimes there's some blurring going on. In fact, we do have a new lens blur tool in Lightroom, which is really quite nice to use. But most of it is going to be lightening and darkening and some color adjustments as well, too. Then I would also say a slight clipping of the blacks. And what the clipping means is that if we change the exposure so that parts of the image go to complete black, meaning one of the three channels that make up our images, we have all our images are made of red, green, and blue pixels, and blended together, it's how we get what we see on the screen. And so when one or more of those channels gets pressed down by moving the slider to make it darker, then that's going to give us what we call clipped blacks. And I actually like that in my images because I feel that one of the things that really makes images stand out is going to be contrast. Contrast just draws our attention. It creates interest and snappiness. And so I think having a good image, a good contrast in your image is really important. Now, that being said, one of the things I've noticed as I'm always trying to learn and get better, is that a lot of the little adjustments that I do in Lightroom and some of the automatic adjustments that I apply cumulatively may give too much contrast and too much saturation to my images. And so I will actually look at going back and lowering the contrast at some point toward the end of my image optimization. Um, so that being said, I still love contrast, but I realize that sometimes all these little adjustments can make your image a little bit too punchy. I like to say that the colors are pleasing, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're accurate. So sometimes we have to punch up the colors a little bit to make up for the experience that the viewer is not having, which was being in the scene when we took the photo. So just to be able to maybe give them a little bit more saturation, a little bit more vibrancy, those can help as well too. And again, that being said, I think that unfortunately people have gone a little bit too far with that, in that sometimes I'll look at images, different exhibits of photos on the internet, different places, and I'll say, wow, that's an interesting photo. And then I'll realize I have never seen that color in the sky in my life. And because they've just kind of pushed things a little bit too far. And so it it's a taste kind of thing. So you have to figure out what works for you. Um, as I kind of in line with composition, I like to think that I want to keep the eyes in the photo. So to that end, I keep bright things away from the edges of my photos. In fact, I'll even put in a slight darkening or a vignette to help to create a framing that should be really subtle in the photo. Um, and also that the image has emotional resonance, that it makes someone experience something by looking at the photo, because of a point of view or the content or just how you photographed it. Um, Forgive me if I've repeated myself, but if you just take a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge and it looks like any other picture, then someone is just going to kind of dismiss it as like, oh, that's that. But if you take the time to really, I want to say, develop a relationship with it, to really spend time working the scene, as we like to say, then you'll come up with photos that are going to be unique to your time with the bridge. And then the last thing is, I want to say, integrity. And I am drawn to the realism of photography. And whenever I see articles that will say things like, replace your boring skies with an interesting sky, I just don't have very much interest. Because for me, photography is a scavenger hunt. What can I see and find in the world that's interesting and then convey that to other people? And how comfortable you feel rearranging things, adding things to your photo, it's up to you. And I think it's fine for people to do whatever they want as long as they're clear with what they're presenting to other people. So that's my 2 cents. Um, Switching back to our, let's see. Can I do that? Let's see. Let me try this other. I keep forgetting that we have this other option. Okay. Will it let me do that? Well, this does not seem to be too happy. So I'm going to do it back the way that it has worked. Let's, there we go. Okay. Okay, so jumping back to the phone, let's pull up this interesting step gradient. And I say that because even though it's not the most dynamic image, I think it's really helpful to not be distracted by, oops, let me just go and reset this. Okay, so this is a step gradient, and I want us to go over to the panel that says light, and that's going to be on the top row to the immediate right where it says auto. And now you'll see that the tools that we have to work with for most of our edits, I want to say. And the way that these sliders work is that it will take the area that it controls and make it darker as we move it to the left and brighter as we move it to the right, with the exception of the contrast slider, which works by increasing the difference between light and dark. Now, one thing I'll say about pulling up here is the histogram. And this is just going to be a graphic representation. And I pulled this up by tapping with 2 fingers and then cycling through. And the histogram is going to show me the dark pixels on the left of the screen, and the bright pixels are going to be on the right-hand side. And the reason I bring this up is because it's helpful to just initially play with these sliders and then to see what they do to the histogram. So the first one is going to be exposure, and we can think of that as just overall lightness and darkness. And so if we take that exposure slider and move it to the right and look at the histogram at the same time, you can see what it's doing is basically taking the initial value of whatever the pixel is and then pushing it over to the left, or rather to the right, and making that brighter. And so now when we look here at the image here, all this area has gotten much lighter. And conversely, if we take the slider and move it to the left, it's going to shove the pixels and make them darker. So that's just kind of a sort of straightforward lightening and darkening. The next slider down is going to be contrast. And as I mentioned, contrast is just simply the difference between the lighter pixels and the darker pixels. So when we take this slider and move it to the right and increase our contrast and look at the histogram, then you can see that as we move it further to the right rather, we are taking the pixels that were predominantly on the right and moving them further to the right, or we are taking the pixels on the left side and then moving them and making those a bit darker as well too. And let me just bring that back down so I can, okay. So we've can take that slider and move it the other way to reduce contrast. And as we do so, now you can see that it's going to be taking those pixels and pushing them into the middle. And so that's going to reduce the contrast. And now you've got this whole middle area with much more similarity in tones. So I'm just going to reset everything there. And now next we've got a couple interesting.
Sorry, Reed, how did you reset everything?
I went to the very top and where that
Reverse.
arrow
Yep,
is,
reset.
and I hit reset, and then I said down at the bottom, I said all. So I'm just changed all adjustments that were ever made. Okay. So the next one down is highlights. And so what highlights are going to be the next brightest thing than the brightest part of the subject or the brightest part of the photo. And this slider does something really pretty interesting. So if I take the slider and I'm usually going to move the highlights down to the left because I'm going to want to make the highlights a little bit darker to bring back more detail in them. It does something else as well too. Just to move it to an extreme, if you look at the histogram, you'll see that it took the bright pixels and it moved them a little bit to the left, but it did something else as well too. If you look at the actual histogram itself, you'll see that not only did it make those pixels a bit darker, but it also spread the pixels out within that area. And when we saw immediately before with the contrast slider, when we increase the difference in the color in the tones of different pixels, we get more contrast. So when we look at this histogram, you can see that not only have we made areas darker, but we've actually increased the contrast as well too. So it actually is great for clouds because not only does it make the clouds a little bit darker, but it actually increases the contrast in that area as well too. So one of my favorite sliders because I think that it's really important to keep as much detail in the brightest areas of your photo as you can. Now, sometimes you just won't be able to bring any detail back because there may not be any. If it's light off of a reflective surface like chrome or water or something else that's what we call a specular highlight, there's just not going to be any detail there. But if you were to take a picture of, say, a marble sculpture in the sun, you would be able to likely see the detail in that marble. It wouldn't be washed out, where if we relied on the camera, it would tend to make things too bright or not give enough detail in those bright areas. So this is actually one of my favorite sliders because unlike the shadow slider that does a similar thing, we are okay with sometimes never being able to see detail. So if you go outside at 4 in the morning and look underneath a tree, there's a good chance that you're just not going to be able to discern any detail just because of there's just no light available. And so not only do we get used to not seeing darkness, or rather detail in darkness, but we can also lose our contrast if we bring up the shadow slider too much. So if I start pulling up the shadows too much, then I'm going to start losing that contrast that I love in my photos by making the darker areas just a little bit too light. So I find that I tend to be more conservative with the shadow slider, so I keep the contrast in my image. The white slider is just going to determine the brightest part of the image, and so that's going to control the pixels at the very end of the image. And similarly, with the black slider, it's going to determine what are the darkest pixels as well too. And a lot of times I'll take that slider and just nudge it a little bit more to the left to really give the contrast that I like in a photo. So now that we have an idea of how those different sliders work, let's kind of apply them to an image.
Reed, before you go on,
Yes.
I wanted to ask, what's the difference between the black slider and the shadows? Because those are the ones that deal more with the darkened pixels.
Yes.
Likewise, whites and highlights seem to affect the lighter colored pixels.
Exactly. So the black slider is going to control how dark the blackest or the darkest part of your photo is going to be. So that is going to impact when you look at the histogram, the darker pixels at the very top. Whereas the shadows are going to be kind of more in this middle, in this end area
Okay.
right next to it. And so they're going to be not the darkest pixels, but next to darkest.
Okay, thank you.
Does that work out?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So let's show how we could work with these. And this is I want to say a well-exposed image. And so I like to say that a well-exposed image should look terrible when you bring it into Lightroom. Now we have the advantage of working in Lightroom Mobile that tends to be, I want to say, a lot more forgiving or a lot more accepting of making adjustments to raw files than the desktop version is to images from a dedicated camera without any adjustments applied to them. So if I were to bring this image into the desktop version with no adjustments, it's going to look like this. So it's pretty horrid looking initially, but technically this is actually a well-exposed photo, meaning that I still have detail in the brightest parts of the photo, in the clouds and in the cliffs, even though it may not look that way. Now, one of the things that I'll do to let's see, let me just get this back to, let's see, to open to the to if that I'll do for an image just to see if there is detail to bring back in is I'll take the exposure slider and I'll just start moving that to the left. And if I can move it all the way to the left, and ideally it should go like almost completely black. Now, this may be a little bit different just because the photo didn't come from this phone. But generally, a well-exposed raw file will let you bring it down to 0 on the exposure, and the whole image should basically be black, meaning that that shows that there's still detail in the brightest areas that we can bring back. So if we were traditionally going to work with a photo the way we would have many years ago, is that we would probably start with maybe the exposure and looking at bringing that down a little bit, and then maybe pulling the highlights down a little bit more if we needed to, and then maybe pulling up the shadows a little bit to get some more detail in the shadows, and then maybe adjusting the brightest point in the photo uh, so that we get a good tonal range, or then maybe working with the black slider and pulling that down to bring in a little bit more contrast. And that works. Those are all good things that to do to a photo. But there's also, I want to say, a better way. And that is if you look to the immediate left of where it says light, it says auto. And what auto will do is it will be the program's attempt to get your image looking decent and get it in the ballpark. And for years, the desktop version of Auto was terrible. And it finally has gotten decent in the last couple of years. And I apply Auto to all my images. And if I don't like it, I can just play around with the sliders. But I find that 80% of what you need to do to an image, you can do just in the light panel, the section that we're just working in. And probably 80% of what you need to do there, you can do simply by hitting auto. So I will do that for all my photos. In fact, I have that applied to the photos. And so what I may frequently do after I apply auto, and interestingly, it looks better on the screen than it does on my screen. So it doesn't have exact duplication of tones here. But frequently what I will do is, and if we just maybe go and take a look at it and see what the program did, is that it brought up the exposure a little bit, so I have a wider tonal range. Or actually, it seems like it brought it down maybe just a little bit. It increased the contrast to +7, and it seems to always add +7 on the contrast. So that's one of the sliders I may need to go back to bringing down or maybe putting into negative territory. The next one is the highlights. And so those, I would say 98% of the time, the slider will go to the left to make the areas darker and to bring in more detail. And then conversely, it brought up the shadows to bring in more detail in the darkest parts. And it looks like it kept the whites about the same and probably pulled down the blacks a little bit to get a little bit more contrast into our photo. So as I said, if you find that all these adjustments are just feeling like it's making the image a little bit too much, a little too over the top, then just see about pulling the contrast slider down, and so it doesn't look so much like a postcard from the gift store.
That's why we buy them, isn't it?
I'm sorry, what?
Isn't that why we buy
Oh,
some
yes, it's
postcards
true.
from the? Yeah.
And I do encourage people, when you go to a national park and you're thinking of photographing there, first place to go is the gift shop. Look at the postcards and you'll see when like all the plants and animals have been on their best behavior and under the best light. And it gives you an idea of like what other people have seen that have felt worthy to put on a postcard.
Well, the auto did a pretty good job, I would say.
Hmm.
I said the auto was a pretty good job, and maybe
Yeah, it
just some
and
subtle
as I
things to
said,
change,
it
maybe.
was terrible for years on the desktop version, but it still looked better than bringing in a raw file without any adjustments to it. But it's, as I said, it's gotten a whole lot better. And so those are what we call global adjustments. They affect the overall image. And when we find that um, we've gone about as far as we can go with the global adjustments, then that's when we may want to switch to other tools to make other adjustments that what would be called local tools or masking type tools. Okay. Um, Before we jump into the um, masking tools and local tools. There's another section that is called under effects. And again, I don't know why they mess with our heads so much because under the desktop version, it's called presence. And so probably the best example to show the presence is going to be this rusty, looks like roof and and bottle or tank. And so I'm just going to bring this, blow it up a little bit just so we can see a little bit more detail, or you probably see better detail just on your own phone. And so we'll go over to effects, which is going to be uh, 1, 2, 3 over from the light panel. And now at the top, we see three categories. We see effects, vignette, and grain. So we're going to want to work with effects. And effects has three sliders. It has texture, clarity, and dehaze. And they all work similarly, but just on different scales in your image. So the texture slider is actually, I would say, going to be a little bit more challenging, I think, to really see it fully utilized on a small screen like the smartphone, but we can still use it. Um, and what the texture will do is it will work on the smallest details in your photo. So if I try and enlarge this a little bit just so it can be seen, and I take the texture slider and move it to the right, you can see that it's increasing that contrast and making that texture really stand out. And as I said, it's going to be a little harder to appreciate the slider on the small screen of a smartphone, but I'm still seeing some effect as well. So the story behind this is kind of interesting in that Photographers were complaining that Lightroom didn't have very good tools to work with people's complexion. And so that they worked on a complexion slider to be able to soften skin, take some of the texture out of it. And they worked on it and refined it and they were happy with it. And then they said, what happens if we move the slider the other way? And all this detail popped back into the photo and they just were aghast and said, oh, we got to change the name of the slider. And so it went from complexion to texture. And that's how we've got the slider. And you can be fairly aggressive with this slider and it won't necessarily make your photo feel really over the top. The next one is going to be clarity. And if we take a look at the, say, upper left of the photo, we'll be able to have probably a better sense. You can see that it's doing a similar kind of thing, but doing it on a larger scale in the photo. And so this is really helping the photo kind of come out and pop. And these sliders, particularly the clarity, you don't need a lot to really make your photo kind of stand out and come forward. Now, let's see if I have another example. No. To get a sense of the dehaze filter, I'm going to just take this one with a kayak, and we're not going to see a lot of impact with the, say, the texture slider in this one because it doesn't have a lot of that fine detail. The clarity is going to give some effect as well too. It's going to, as you can see, it's darkening the water in the foreground and creating a little bit more um, clarity and contrast there. But the dehaze filter is almost like a polarizing filter. And so when we start applying this to the photo, you can see it does a really significant job of darkening the sky, adding more contrast. And so this is a really handy and useful slider, but just know that it's very easy to go over the board, over the top with the slider. So when you do use this, know that you may have to back down your contrast a little bit, or because it also adds some blueness to your photo, you may have to warm the photo up with the white balance in the color section. But really handy tool.
Reed,
Yes.
in your experience, how often do you use these effects versus what's used in light? Because, for example, I see some similar action between clarity and highlights because it adds this lightness over the picture. So I was just curious, in your experience, how do you, what is like 80% of the time, how do you use the tools? Which tools do you use most frequently?
Pretty much the order that I'm showing you them, showing you uh, in. I'm going to
Okay.
use the light panel first because I like to think of that as you want to deal with the biggest problems first. And so the overall exposure of the photo and the other tools like the clarity and texture and dehaze, they're kind of more refinements. So you want to apply them after you've done your basic or your light adjustments.
Okay.
And I tend to use them fairly frequently. Now, there are a ton of tools in Lightroom, but I would say most or a lot of them I don't use very much of the time. They're nice that they're there, but don't really need to use them. And don't think that you have to make a lot of adjustments to every image. I find that if I spend too much time working on an image, it will look like I've spent too much time working on an image. And another thing that happens for me is that the image will at some point turn on me, and I'll never be able to look at that image without being reminded of how tormented I became making it, trying to look just right. So I would say, in a lot of times, less is better than more. And I think that the phones are doing a pretty good job of getting a decent photo a lot of the time. I remember when the first iPhones came out and kind of identifying as a photographer, I felt embarrassed to just send a photo to somebody without having to do brightness and adjustments to it just because it looked so mediocre. But the quality of these phones has gotten downright impressive. So it's why the sales of traditional um, point and shoot cameras has gone down like about, I think, 90% or so or more since like 2007. In fact, camera companies aren't making them. In fact, they're now going up in value because, uh, you know, younger generations that never grew up with point and shoot cameras are kind of discovering them. I was really surprised that a couple weeks ago I sold a camera for a student, and it was just a 12 megapixel point and shoot Canon, had some zoom in it, and it sold in 2 hours for $160. And that is more than probably like twice as much as I've been watching a camera that I'm needing to sell as well too, which is a film camera from the 1960s and 70s that was a Pentax Spotmatic, which was an excellent camera. And, you know, seeing that they're having trouble selling that one. So it's really kind of crazy in terms of what passes for photography than cameras that people want. So we've got a lot of choices for us now. So any other questions coming up? Okay, so let's start looking at some of the local adjustment tools. We can stay with this kayak tool, and as much as I love the masking tools and they do a great job, there's sometimes that some of the other tools work faster and give great results as well too. So if we go over to the color tool and we go in the upper right corner where it says color mix and touch that, then you can see that we can choose all these different colors, and then we can choose to change the hue, which is the color, or the saturation is the intensity of the color. And then there's luminance, which is just the simple lightness or darkness of that color. So my recommendation is the easiest way to work with this tool is to ignore all those colors and sliders and simply touch that little thing at the top here that looks like a steering wheel. And when we do, the options seem to diminish, and we're left with the hue, saturation, and luminance at the bottom. But this is actually a much easier way of working because what the app will do is we want to choose, say, the what we want to do, either change the hue, the saturation, or the luminance. And so um, maybe I'll try let's try luminance on this one. So maybe I'm not happy with that boat. The yellow looks a little washed out in the sun and want to make it a little bit brighter. So instead of trying to figure out which slider I need to try to move that we looked at before, and just to let you know, most colors actually are a combination of two sliders. What we can simply do is touch the photo, and the app will sample the color underneath our fingertip, and then simply by moving our finger up or down, it will change that color under our finger. Now, one thing to know is that it's going to select every color in the photo. So this isn't going to work very well if I were, say, wanting to make, say, someone's sweater darker and they have a blue sweater, but they also have blue eyes. because then I would be making their eyes darker as well too, which would look pretty weird. But simply by, say, going in and say if I wanted to, say, increase the saturation of this boat a little bit more to kind of clean it up, I can do it with just the simple tool. And so, as I said, I still like a lot of the tools, but find that this works really quickly as well too. Similarly, if I grab this other photo, I find that if I go back to that color mix and then go back to that wheel thing again, I find that I'm just getting used to the photo that I'm looking at that you're seeing on my screen is a little bit different than my photo. Uh, so I find that actually this looks better here. But on my screen, it looks a little bit more yellow, kind of more pale. And so it's going to probably look, I want to say, a bit more like that. So I'll just do that for exaggeration to show you what it looked like. And so I find that a lot of times that if I just go in and change the hue and just work on, say, increasing the hue a bit to change it from the yellow to the green, just a little bit, I find that it's more pleasing for me. And as I said, it's a great tool when what you want to adjust is isolated, meaning that it's not throughout that color is not throughout the photo. Because as I said, this doesn't have any masking built into it. So know that all the colors in that photo are going to go along for a ride with it. To get out of this tool, I'll simply go ahead and hit that little steering wheel thing again. And that gives me back into the color mixer and then click done. And then that brings me back into the color palette portion. Any questions on that? Okay. Um, Let me show you one other tool that we've got now that I'm really liking. And this photo with will work well with it, I believe. I haven't tried it. And that's going to be the blur tool. And just know that what you're seeing as an example is going to be a little over the top. Let me see if it's possible for me to try and give a bigger screen view, but then it gets tricky because now I lose my tools. Oh, okay. So unfortunately that may not work. Oh well. Okay. Let me just move it back this way. Or let's see, will it let me do it? No. Now I just lose all my tools, unfortunately. Okay, so this is the blur tool, and let me just blow it up a little bit so you can get an idea about how it works. So first of all, when you access this tool, it will take a second for it to load because what it's doing is looking for the subject in the photo. And once it does, it creates a mask that I don't believe is really visible, but know that it's there. And if you look underneath the amount slider, we have different types of how the filter will apply the blur tool to light coming from behind the subject. So if you are thinking of like a scene of like a downtown at night where you've got lights coming from different directions, and you'll see what's referred to as like the lens flare. So we can change the shape of how that looks. Most of the time I'm fine with the first one. In fact, I actually have to shoot some photos to find that type of light to give as an example because I just don't have any in my collections. And so with the blur tool, I can simply move that forward a bit and now let's see, is this calculating here? Or is this just doing something weird? Um,
Well, you hit that camera icon with the red dot, and if you do
oh,
that,
thank you.
it turns the image to some sort of negative or something.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Thanks for spotting me on that one. Yeah. I'll explain that one in a second. But if we are to just increase the blur amount here and give it a second, let me just pull it up a bit. And the impact of this on this image is not huge. I have to really increase it a lot to get the blur. So it's interesting to see that. So if you see the, I've turned it up a fair amount. You can see that boat in the background has blurred. If you want to see it before in a lot of these tools, if you just touch and hold the screen, it will show you the before picture. And then when we let go, the after. So we've got more of that blurring. So
Reed, mine's still like preparing for the first time. Is it meant to take this long?
which type of which camera do you have? Or
The 13 Pro.
I wouldn't think that it's should be that slow. They are calling this an early access, meaning that they may still be working with refining it. So they may be working on the speed of it, but the functionality, I think, actually works well.
Okay, I'll just watch you do it then.
Okay.
And did you already mention what the different uh, uh, blurs are, or how do they differ? The circle, bubble, etc.
Yeah, if you want, I can. So the circle is going to be just kind of a traditional flare that you would see from a from a camera with out of focus lights in the background. The bubble is going to focus that light to be a little bit darker on the edge of it. And so that will be highlighted just a little bit more on the edge and not as uniform. The 5 blade is going to probably be a little bit more reminiscent of a rangefinder camera. I had a Canon G3 that had a 5 blade iris shutter, iris aperture, and so it would produce pentagons in the background of the image. The ring light is like the worst. If you've ever shot with a lens that have the internal telephoto to it, and it was called a like a ring telephoto, where it actually had a mirror in the middle of the lens, and it would make these really kind of unpleasant donuts in the background. That's what the ring would be. And then the cat eye is going to be less than round. So it's going to be kind of more of like a sliver shape. Now, with the focus, I'm glad I hit that by accident. You can see that we can change it. It was first either detecting where the subject was, or if you're not happy with how it's chosen that, what you can do is change this focus here and then change it to point. And then it'll bring up a similar like dropper to what we had for the white balance tool, where we can select the thing that we want to be in focus, and then it will blur the background from there. So right now it's working on refining that. And so now it's actually done a much better job with that than just moving the slider as it was before. So this is actually, I think, really handy on a smartphone where we tend to have a lot of depth of field because the lens is a wide angle lens and the sensor is very small. So the two of those tend to create a image with a lot of depth of field. And so with this, if you're happy with the results, just go ahead and hit the check mark in the lower right corner, and then it will go ahead and apply that effect to the photo. Okay. So I wanted to show you that because that's one of what they call the premium features, which is what you are getting for the 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 trial basis here. So let's go back and grab the picture of our our dog Ellie. So if we've got this one, now we can jump into masking and probably spend the rest of our time with this. So I believe I also sent out an additional handout on masking. I'm not sure if I had that in the handouts or not, but know that it's a pretty thorough explanation of the masking as well too. So if we go into masking, which is going to be over on the uh, bottom row, a little bit to the right of center, it's that circle. It kind of looks like a sun cloud, or uh, we can pull that up, and they kind of make you go through another step here. And so then you have to push the plus on the right-hand side, and then you have to ask, what type of mask do you want? And so the first two masks are what we call the AI masks, or artificial intelligence, where it will actually look through your photo and determine what the subject is or the sky. The next one down is a brush tool, where we can subtly brush in the effect in an area. So if you've worked in a dark room or have a familiarity with the idea of burning and dodging a photo, of being able to make areas lighter or darker in just in a subtle way, the brush tool is still one of my favorite tools. The next is we have a linear gradient, which allows the effect to be gradually applied through the photo. And then the next one is a radial gradient, which allows us to make either a circle or an ellipse, and then to have the effect applied either inside or outside of that selection. And then the last couple ones are color range. So we can actually make a mask based on color, and we can actually make a mask based on luminance, meaning lightness or darkness. So I find that most of my adjustments tend to be at the far ends of the spectrum. So dealing with areas that are too light or too dark, because if I were able to make the adjustments with the other tools, I would be able to do so. So it's coming into the masking that allows me to deal with the stuff that doesn't get taken care of sufficiently with the sliders. Now, a couple things that are great about these masks are all these masks can be inverted, which means that while we don't have a background selection tool, we can select the background by selecting the subject and inverting it. Similarly, we don't have a foreground tool, but we can go ahead and select the sky and then invert that. And similarly with all the other tools. Now, what's also interesting is that we can also add and subtract any of these tools from each other as well too. So we could do things like have um, a gradual gradient through the sky, but then we can say subtract the subject so that the subject wouldn't get dark in addition to the sky as well too, if someone were standing and had the sky in the background. So once you start playing with them, you start to see the possibilities of how these can all work with each other. So for just a simple mask here, well, I hope that light
Your
gods are
screen
looking.
has not updated.
It's what?
It's still on the menu of create a new mask, so it hasn't updated. We're not seeing if you're changing something.
Oh, I haven't because I haven't selected which mask to use.
Oh, okay.
So now I'm just going to say, and we're in California, so things happen in your mind first. So I'm visualizing this mask working correctly because I've never tried it on this one. I'm going to simply say select subject and give it a second. And it actually did a really good job. But it's not the subject that I want in this case because if we look at the exposure of Ellie, it's actually, I think, fine. Uh, the blacks have detail in them. There's a nice light in her eye. So I actually like that one. So I like her, but I find that the background is going to be a little bit bright. So what I can do then is on the left-hand side above the garbage can, which you'd hit if you want to get rid of a mask, is I can simply invert it. And so now it's gone ahead and selected the background instead. So now I can just make the adjustments that I want to apply to here. And I know that the highlights were bright, so I'm going to want to bring those down. And that's really all I need to do. I don't need to even go into making an adjustment with the exposure. So just
So
simply
that
bringing
is,
down the highlights, which added some contrast as well too, was enough to get that photo where I need it to go.
so Reed, that's just changing the highlights of the background. It's not changing, like earlier when we didn't select a subject, it was changing the whole picture. This is just changing the background. Is that what's happening?
Yes, it's only changing the background, and because I only moved the highlights, it's only changing the highlights in the background.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. And so if we look on the right-hand side, we actually get a little mask showing what is being adjusted. So that's a little icon of the mask. And so there's an adage in the photography world, white reveals, black conceals. So white is where the mask is and where the effect is going to be applied, and black is where the effect will be held back from. Okay, so we've got that. So I'm thinking that that's looking pretty good. So I will just go ahead and accept that. So we've got that. Now you can go back in and add additional masks as well too. So you can see that we could actually add or subtract from that particular mask as well too with the other tools. But before I go into that, why don't we go to the three dots in the upper right-hand corner? And we don't have as much control of the color of the mask as we do in the desktop version, but you can see under color, we can have our mask be one of three colors. And I don't know why they don't give us more, but this is still useful. I frequently will use a magenta mask on my desktop version because there's not a lot of real magenta in the world, so it tends to work well as a mask. So the next best thing for that is red, and so I'll go ahead and use the red as my color. Now, we can also change what are called the mode right above it. And if you look at them, we have either a color overlay or a color overlay on black and white, and just a variety of different ones. I tend to prefer the color overlay on black and white because that will make the mask color and the background or the part that's not masked black and white. So it just helps to do a better job of seeing where my mask actually is in the photo. If I want to be really precise about the mask, I'll change that overlay to white on black, and then it will go ahead and make a mask similar to what I would see in Photoshop. So now I have an absolute black and white mask of what's going on in the photo. So if I know that I want to say clean the mask up in some way, that I can have a really precise view of what the mask looks like. But don't really change it much here in the app. So I'll change that back to the color overlay on black and white. So just to show some other examples of how some of these masks will work. Let's see if we then have a probably add another example here, but let me grab this photo and let me just make it a little bit darker. Here, just add a little bit more. So it looks a little bit better. Okay, so if we were to go into, say, our masking tool, and let me just on this one, if I were just to say select the sky, then it does a pretty good job of selecting just the sky. And so then that would allow us to do things like if we were to say pull down the highlights a little bit more, you can see that that helps to bring in the color. And if I wanted to maybe even pull down the exposure a little bit. Now this is looking a little over the top on what I'm seeing on the screen. So take it with the understanding that you're probably going to not want to have as severe adjustments as what you're seeing, but just that we've got some of these different tools here to work with. And if you like that, then we can go ahead and accept that. So you can see that that's a mask that's just affected the sky. Let's take this photo and go back to the kayak here and show you the linear gradient. So if I feel like maybe the right and the left side is a little bit too bright, and then maybe one of the things that I can do is then apply a linear gradient. And if I come across here from the left and pull it over, then you can see that we have a linear gradient mask that consists of 3 lines. And so the first line that you see is going to be where the effect is at 0%. The second line here is going to be where the effect is at 50%. And the last line here is going to be where the effect is being applied at 100%.
Sorry,
And
Reed, can you go back to the beginning? How did you get into this? How did you get
Sure.
this type of
So it's in the masking tools again. So I'll go
Yep.
back to that little icon here with the next to the
Yep,
Band-Aid.
yeah.
That's the masking tool. So
Yeah.
select that one, and then it will make me say plus, and then it asks what type of mask do you want? And in this case, I'm going to
Oh,
say a
linear
linear
gradient.
gradient.
That's right. That's right. Okay.
Okay, and then I'm just going to go across in the photo here and know that you don't have to have a, a vertical or perpendicular. You can vary the angle of it as well too. Uh, so this one, maybe I'll just follow the water and go an angular like that. And then maybe in this case, then if I work on, say, pulling down those highlights a little bit, and maybe the exposure a little bit, you can see that we just get a little bit of darkness on that left side. So it
Mhm.
helps to just kind of tone it down a little bit.
Yeah.
You can also then, if you find that you want to move your mask afterwards, then you can reposition it. You also have this handle on the end here so that you can rotate it as well too.
Hmm.
And then if you're wanting to keep the mask, again, that's the check mark in the lower right corner, or you can reject it with the X in the left side. And so I'll just go ahead and accept it. And that was just a really slight darkening. Probably not the best example, but you get an idea of how that does work with darkening. So I find that for images where the light is at a really strong direction, and it's just going to feel really bright, then I know that that's going to be like, say, a good candidate for that gradient tool. So, like as an example, like this image here, um, maybe it would lend itself well to just darkening that edge up a little bit. So if I then go with a linear gradient and come up here at an angle, and then if I just work on, say, bringing down the highlights here, you can see that it's done a pretty good job of just darkening those highlights right along that edge here of the cloud. You see that? Oops. So you can just pull this back and whoops, so that's gonna be, I'll just pull it off to the side. That's gonna be before that linear gradient, and then this is gonna be after. So it's just gonna be a darkening. And then if you want the effect to be spread out more, then you can spread the distance of the how the effect is going to be applied in the photo. So it gives you the ability to keep refining it afterwards as well too. Let's see if I can find another example. I think that may be a good idea for that one. Um, Looking at, say, some of these other tools like the radial tool. Going back to that image here, and why don't I just reset this one? So if we go into the masking tool on this one, and this time I choose the radial gradient, then if I go ahead and touch and then drag out here, then I get this radial gradient, which is really a yucky edge here. So this is generally probably not a mask that you would want. For one, first of all, I want to affect the area outside. So maybe I want to do a slight darkening of the area around the boat to bring more attention to it. So in this case, I'm going to invert the mask and have it be on the outside. But one of the issues I'm still seeing with this one, it's got too hard of an edge. So the transition for where the mask is applied at 100% and where it's applied at 0%. And that's called the feathering. So one of the things that
You
we
know,
can
Reed,
go in um, is to adjust the feathering. And so the feathering adjustment is going to be on the left-hand side above the invert tool. And now, as you can see, is when we increase the feathering, it will encroach a little bit more into the image or the place that we want to keep, but it makes the transition softer. So what I may want to do then is change the shape or enlarge the mask that I've created here, maybe reposition it a little bit. And now I would just probably want to go in and maybe just hold down the exposure a little bit on the outside here. And so you can see it's almost kind of works as like a spot um, a spotlight kind of tool. So it just helps to kind of create and add a little bit more attention to the photo, to the subject itself.
You know, I used that radio mask on the picture with the tree and the water underneath because it has the shape of a oval,
Mm-hmm.
and that was interesting too.
That's a good point. So yeah, when you start like working with seeing how the shapes can be used in the photos, um, it really opens up a lot of possibilities. So as an example, just to carry on with the masking here, if I wanted to just say work with the yellow of that boat, say I'm just not happy with it. One, I just go ahead and take that mask because it's decent, but now I can just say mask and then I can go ahead and say plus. So now I'm going to create another type of mask, and this mask is going to be based on color range. And so when I select that tool, it's going to go ahead and select the the subject as well too. And so I'm going to have the ability to refine it as well too, if it's picking up or too little or too much. So you can see if I say push it to the right to refine it, it's going to pick up a little bit more of the hull of that boat that it wasn't picking up before. But it's also going to be picking up colors in the background. So know that it's going to pick up those colors, or maybe we may have to go in and subtract or erase those. But for right now, I'll just take this one, I think is a good example, and then go ahead and say apply. And then now that that mask is selected, I can go into color, and then I can do things like play with the saturation and pull that up. Or maybe if I even wanted to, I could even change the color to some degree, but I'd have to do a better job at selecting the whole boat. But you get the idea that I'm just working with that one particular color because it's making the mask based on the color that was selected. So I think I'll,
So it looks like you can have many masks in one picture.
yes. I don't think that there's a real limit to the masks. In fact, with the masks, we can start getting into adding and subtracting masks from each other as well too. Let me just show you the one last mask, uh, in case that you have a picture that say that the highlights are just not uh, being pulled down as much as you want. So we can make a mask just based on the highlights of the photo. So again, I'll go into masking, and this time I'll say plus, and then I'll say the luminance range. And so I can go ahead and select the bright part of the photo here. And down at the bottom, you'll see that we can refine our selection. And so we have on the right here, we have this gauge here or this little box, and this shows us of what is absolutely selected. And so you can think of this little box as having handles on the end. So we can actually increase or decrease what is absolutely selected. And then we have what's called essentially the fall off. This one on the far end of it, this is going to determine the transition or how soft that is. So if we pull it to the right, you can see that it's going to be defined a lot more just to the very brightest areas. The danger you run into is that you start getting hard edges in your masking. And so we generally want to have a transition or a little bit of softness so you can't see obviously where the adjustment has been applied. So if I think that that's a good masking tool, then I can say accept the mask. Then I can go in and make adjustments. In this case, just maybe pulling down the highlights a bit, and we just make that a little bit bigger. You can see that that's actually doing a good job of bringing back a little bit of that detail in the brightest areas here. We can make it a little bit bigger here so you can really see. So you can see how that is a little bit bright here, and just by pulling that down. We can also add to that and maybe just a little pull down the exposure just a little bit as well too. So frequently I find that just pulling down the highlight slider isn't enough, but if I just bring the exposure down just a very tiny bit, then it will be enough. But let's see, that's the wrong slider. That's what's going on. So in this case, I have to be careful because I see if I bring these highlights down too much, I'm starting to lose definition in there as well too. So that may also be a function of my mask as well too. So you can always go back and refine the masks as well too. Now you can also, with the masks, go ahead and duplicate them so you can add and subtract from them. You can actually rename the masks if you wanted to, and duplicate it. So you may want to apply a different effect, but have it in a different mask, but they have the same selection. So that's when you would have duplicate. So sometimes let me show you an example of let's see, that we would do. Let's see what we get for this one if we say go ahead and select the subject. So if we say select subject, it did a pretty good job of getting just the house there. Um, it's not going to have as good of a tool as the tool in the desktop version, but say we wanted to add to this mask as well too. We can then go down to the plus and minus right below on the right hand side, and then you can either add to the mask or you can subtract from the mask. So in this case, I think it's generally going to be probably easier to subtract from masks than to add. But say I wanted to add that house in the background. So this is then going to ask me what other tool do I want to use? And unfortunately, there's a tool in the desktop version that hasn't made it over to the mobile version yet, but hopefully it will come soon. So what I could do is um, say that I wanted to add on with the brush, then I can just have different controls of the brush here. So I can control the size of the brush, and then I can control the hardness of the brush or the feathering of it. And then once I've got those, I can also change the flow of the brush as well too. So the flow is essentially how much mask I'm applying. And so if I'm adding to a mask, I'm going to probably keep the flow high at 100%. If I'm just going to be lightly brushing in the photo, then I'm going to probably have a lot lower flow. So let me just undo that. And because I just added when I didn't want to. So let me just say add and then say use the brush. And in this case, maybe my brush is too big. Let me just undo that. And then say add, and then go back to the brush, but let me do a much smaller size. Maybe increase the photo here. And now I could just go in and brush and add to the mask back here. And unfortunately, as I said, I'm still waiting for the other tool to be added on that we have in the desktop. But
If
so
you
now
had selected a subject, we wouldn't have caught that as another object in the picture.
yeah, so that's exactly what it's called in the desktop version. It's called the object selection. Unfortunately, we don't have that here yet. And it already selected the church as the subject, but it didn't add on to it. So it's not going to recognize that other building in the background as the subject if it didn't grab it initially. One thing that I could do is maybe just add on to the bottom if it didn't grab the very edge of the building here. Well, that's a little bit much. If you find that you need to erase the mask on the left-hand side, there's an eraser, so we can actually go in and clean things up if we need to. So I just added to the bottom of that building. And so once we've got the adjustment that, or the mask that we want, then we could do things like maybe we could go into color and just warm that up and, just really have a much warmer tone just to that building itself. But I'd probably have to pull down the exposure a little bit to see that, just to warm it up a little bit. Building's pretty neutral, so it's not going to pick up a lot of color to warm up. But that just kind of gives you the idea of how we can have multiple masks, add and subtract masks as well too, to select different parts of our image. So I should probably think about calling it a night, even though we started a little bit late. So my recommendation is to play with these masking tools and play with that blur tool to see if that you want to keep them as premium features moving forward. And I think what I'd like to do is, if you want to do so, I'll make it optional. I'll give you the option to to photograph and make adjustments to images and send the images to me and tell me what your thinking is as to what you wanted to do. If you want to do that.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Sounds good.
So, other questions before we call it a night?
None for us, thanks.
Okay. All right. So these tools kind of start to make some sense.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well, enjoy the weekend. Remember, we're gonna hit rain on Saturday. It's coming back. So last chance to pull up that Italian thistle that's starting to bloom before it takes over the whole county. So,
All right, thank you.
all
Thank
right,
you.
thanks so much, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
All right,
Thanks.
bye-bye.